In an unprecedented move that signals a bold leap into the future, Burkina Faso has officially unveiled a transformative billion-dollar airport development project that is set to redefine the nation's infrastructural identity, elevate its status on the African continent, and serve as a strategic gateway between West Africa and global trade and tourism markets. The announcement, made by President Ibrahim Traoré in a nationally televised address, was met with both domestic jubilation and international intrigue, as the ambitious scope of the project dwarfs anything the landlocked nation has previously attempted in terms of aviation infrastructure. Situated strategically just outside the capital city of Ouagadougou, the new airport, tentatively named New Ouagadougou International Gateway, is being designed as a multifunctional Aerotropolis, not just a transport hub but a sprawling complex that integrates logistics, technology, hospitality, commerce, and culture into a singular ecosystem. Designed in collaboration with world-class architects and financed through a strategic blend of public-private partnerships, sovereign investment funds, and multilateral development banks, the project will span over 25 square kilometers and feature 3 runways capable of accommodating the world's largest aircraft, state-of-the-art terminals modeled on environmental sustainability, and a dedicated cargo village intended to transform Burkina Faso into a central West African logistics hub. The economic implications of this project are staggering. Forecasts suggest it could increase the country's GDP by up to 5% annually over the next decade through expanded trade, tourism, and aviation-linked industries. More than just concrete and terminals, this airport represents a vision for sovereignty, connectivity, and national transformation, especially in a geopolitical climate where African nations are increasingly asserting their independence from neo-colonial financial structures and externally imposed development models. President Traoré, in his announcement, emphasized that the airport is not a symbol of excess but a foundation of self-determination, and revealed that over 60% of construction materials will be sourced locally, while over 70% of labor will be Burkinabe, providing more than 40,000 jobs during the construction phase and tens of thousands more through indirect employment in supporting industries. Central to the project is a special economic zone, SEZ, adjacent to the airport site, which will host multinational logistics companies, tech startups, regional headquarters, and customs-free warehouses designed to streamline import-export operations across the Sahel. The airport will also host Africa's first Pan-African Aviation Training Academy, with training modules in aircraft maintenance, air traffic control, flight operations, and drone logistics, supported by a coalition of African universities and aviation bodies. To ensure environmental stewardship, the project includes a 100 MW solar energy park to power its core operations, green roofing on all buildings, and an advanced water recycling system that will reduce waste and promote ecological sustainability in a region often challenged by desertification. The global reaction has been swift. Development agencies from across Asia and Latin America have praised the project as a replicable model of Global South infrastructure planning, while observers from the African Union have described it as a new benchmark in regional ambition. The World Bank, though not a direct funder, acknowledged the transparency protocols in place, citing Burkina Faso's commitment to open tendering, third-party auditing, and stakeholder oversight. China, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey have already expressed interest in long-term investment partnerships, and several African airlines have announced plans to establish routes or maintenance facilities at the new site, which is projected to handle 20 million passengers annually upon completion, 10 times the capacity of the current Ouagadougou airport. But beyond the statistics and architectural renderings, the emotional resonance of the project is equally profound. For a country long overlooked in global development narratives and often associated with instability and poverty, the billion-dollar airport is a defiant act of rebranding, one that proclaims Burkina Faso not as a victim of history, but a shaper of its own future. Local communities, once skeptical, have increasingly rallied behind the initiative, especially after a comprehensive land compensation plan and community integration program were revealed, ensuring that displaced populations are resettled with dignity and offered priority employment opportunities. Educational institutions have already begun adapting curricula to align with the technical skills required for the coming aviation ecosystem, and local artisans and cultural ambassadors have been invited to design parts of the terminal interiors, ensuring that the spirit of Burkina Faso is embedded within the physical structure. President Traoré has positioned this airport not as an end in itself, but as the cornerstone of a broader developmental vision, one that includes upgrading rail and highway links to Mali, Niger, Ghana, and Côte d'Ivoire, creating a seamless West African trade corridor that could redefine regional commerce and integration. Critics have questioned the timing and cost, especially given the nation's current security challenges, but Traoré and his planning council have countered that development and stability are not sequential goals but parallel pursuits, and that prosperity can serve as a bulwark against extremism and disenfranchisement. The project has also sparked intellectual discourse across Africa, where academics and urban planners are now debating how to balance mega infrastructure with equitable development, and how to ensure that such projects serve the people rather than becoming symbols of elite ambition. Meanwhile, international media has begun to shift its tone on Burkina Faso, from framing it as a fragile state to acknowledging its role as a pioneering force in African self-development. The symbolic implications are massive. By building one of the most advanced airports on the continent, Burkina Faso is asserting that African nations can and must take ownership of the infrastructure narrative, not simply inherit outdated models from colonial or Bretton Woods institutions. In press conferences, Traoré has been unapologetic in his tone, stating, "We do not need permission to rise. We are architects of our own sky." That phrase, "architects of our own sky," has since become a rallying cry on social media, and the airport project itself is now a case study for think tanks, infrastructure forums, and Pan-African development summits. As construction begins with the groundbreaking ceremony attended by regional leaders, the hum of machinery, the gathering of cranes, and the mobilization of laborers signal more than just the start of a project, they mark the ignition of a new national identity. An identity that rejects dependency, embraces scale, and confronts global systems on its own terms. The billion-dollar airport is not merely a physical construction, it is a psychological breakthrough. It is a declaration that Burkina Faso will no longer be seen solely through the lens of what it lacks, but through the clarity of what it envisions and has the will to build. And as the runways stretch across the Sahel, and as steel skeletons rise into the hot West African sun, the eyes of an entire continent, and indeed, the world, will watch to see whether this audacious bet on progress will indeed take flight and alter the arc of a nation's future forever. As the early phases of construction accelerated under the watchful eyes of both national stakeholders and international observers, Burkina Faso's airport megaproject began to move beyond its role as a symbol into a living, evolving organism that started reshaping the country's economic structure, foreign policy orientation, and societal rhythm in ways that even the initial planners had only theorized. The industrial zones adjoining the airport footprint attracted an unexpected surge of investor interest from African tech firms, logistics conglomerates from the Gulf region, and French and German companies seeking a strategic foothold in the evolving Sahel corridor, particularly as tensions between France and West African military governments gave way to a new kind of pragmatic diplomacy built on mutual benefit rather than historical dominance. Notably, Burkina Faso's Ministry of Commerce began releasing weekly progress reports, showcasing transparent allocation of funds, detailed procurement procedures, and live satellite tracking of the construction site to counter any narratives of corruption or inefficiency, a move that drew praise from international anti-corruption NGOs and cemented the project as a benchmark in transparent state-led infrastructure development. The project's green credentials also began gaining traction beyond the continent, with the African Development Bank and European Green Deal agencies identifying the airport as a test case for climate-resilient infrastructure in the Global South, prompting new lines of concessional financing and technical cooperation around sustainable aviation fuels, carbon-neutral construction materials, and smart logistics infrastructure. Within Burkina Faso, local economies within a 100-kilometer radius of the project site began transforming at a blistering pace. Land values tripled. New transportation services sprang up, vocational training centers rapidly expanded enrollment, and small businesses, from cafes to construction suppliers, began to experience surging demand that created a kind of bottom-up economic renaissance not seen in the country in decades. President Traoré's administration, aware of the risks of unchecked urban sprawl and inflation, began introducing zoning regulations, tax incentives for cooperative enterprises, and strict codes of labor rights compliance to ensure that growth remained inclusive and beneficial to local communities rather than being monopolized by external contractors or politically connected elites. Meanwhile, regional neighbors such as Mali and Niger formally requested customs agreements and shared transport corridors linked directly to the new airport, and a tri-country summit hosted in Ouagadougou led to the creation of a new multilateral trade initiative, tentatively named the Sahel Skyway Pact, aimed at turning Burkina Faso into the logistics and air cargo nucleus of inland West Africa. This convergence of regional collaboration and domestic momentum caught the attention of African diaspora investors, many of whom had long been hesitant to reinvest in the continent due to fears of instability, but who now saw in Burkina Faso a credible, data-driven blueprint for how a landlocked nation could rewrite its economic destiny through aviation. A wave of high-profile diaspora entrepreneurs and engineers returned to the country, bringing with them technical expertise, venture capital, and global networks, and soon new innovation hubs and smart warehouses began springing up around the airport's perimeter, creating a fusion zone of Afro-optimism and cutting-edge logistics that rivaled emerging hubs in East Africa and the Gulf. Culturally, the airport became a canvas of national expression, with local artists commissioned to design murals, sculptures, and multimedia installations that would greet visitors with a uniquely Burkinabe visual identity, drawing from Mossi heritage, revolutionary symbolism, and Pan-African unity. International airlines, noticing the project's momentum and Burkina Faso's diplomatic neutrality, began signing MOUs for future route launches, including Ethiopian Airlines, Qatar Airways, Turkish Airlines, and Kenya Airways, each of which envisioned the new Ouagadougou terminal not merely as a destination, but as a transit anchor for deeper intra-African and transcontinental connectivity. Academic institutions also began evolving in response to the airport's gravity. Universities launched degrees in aviation management, renewable energy systems, and urban logistics, while exchange programs with institutions in Singapore, UAE, and Rwanda facilitated a talent flow that turned Burkina Faso from an educational exporter to a regional skills importer. Meanwhile, as global supply chains continued to shift due to geopolitical uncertainty and climate disruptions, multinational corporations began looking to the Sahel corridor as an alternative land-air transport chain, and Burkina Faso's airport became a central node in this emerging narrative, not just of African resilience but of African centrality to 21st-century global trade. Satellite towns around the airport began to sprout, designed with smart infrastructure, fiber optic internet, electric bus systems, and integrated waste recycling, all modeled as zero-emission settlements to support the airport's long-term environmental goals. To maintain security, the government established a special aviation police joint task force trained in both counterterrorism and cyber defense, with support from African Union advisors and private defense contractors, making it one of the most secure aviation environments in West Africa. Tourism, too, began experiencing a revival, as travel influencers and documentarians flocked to capture the airport's evolution and promote Burkina Faso's untapped cultural wealth. Its UNESCO-recognized mud architecture, masked festivals, music traditions, and revolutionary history, thereby redefining the country's image in the global imagination from a conflict zone to a rising cultural and commercial destination. Importantly, this transformation was not occurring in a vacuum. The people of Burkina Faso, long denied the fruits of major infrastructure, began asserting greater agency in national planning discussions, attending community briefings, proposing design changes, and holding officials accountable via a digital portal that tracked every phase of the airport's progress. President Traoré's bet on national pride fused with visionary engineering began paying political dividends as well, with his approval ratings soaring and his administration being credited by even his critics for executing a grand vision without the endemic dysfunction that often plagues mega projects in developing nations. The IMF and World Bank, while initially skeptical, began citing the project as an example of controlled ambition, infrastructure designed with realistic timelines, local inclusion, and export-oriented strategy rather than vanity. But perhaps the most significant development came 6 months into construction, when a consortium of Pan-African banks led by Afreximbank and Ecobank announced a $2.3 billion supplementary financing package for Phase 2, which would include the creation of a regional rail link to the port of Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, an on-site drone port for last-mile delivery across the Sahel, and a digital customs platform to streamline cargo inspection and tracking, effectively turning the airport into a fully integrated multimodal gateway. That moment, the shift from airport to Continental Logistics Command Center, signaled that Burkina Faso had officially crossed the threshold from follower to leader in the African development landscape. Global media began running special features under headlines like, "The sky belongs to Ouagadougou," and "Burkina Faso, from landlocked to sky-linked," and major aviation summits invited Burkinabe officials as keynote speakers to explain how they achieved this momentum without succumbing to the debt traps or governance failures that have plagued similar projects elsewhere. Critics who once scoffed at the notion of a billion-dollar project in a country with security challenges now found themselves re-evaluating their assumptions, while leaders from neighboring countries began sending study teams to learn from Burkina Faso's Aerovision model. By the end of the first year, as cranes dotted the skyline and the runways neared completion, Burkina Faso had not only changed its infrastructure but had permanently altered its trajectory, reframing itself from a peripheral state to a central artery in the heart of a rising Africa, proving that with vision, discipline, and national will, even the most unlikely nations can rise and define the future on their own terms.